It's RPG a day time once again. They've gone a kind of arty and abstract route this time. There's just like one word prompts for each day. I'm going to do these. I'm going to record them ahead of time. I'm going to do them as videos, whereas I've done it as blogs in the past. And no, I'm not wearing the same outfit day after day. I'm recording all of these ahead, okay? And I just finished my workout before I made all of these, which is why I look a bit sweaty and unkempt. With that out of the way, the prompt for today is first. Now, the obvious thing to do is to talk about the first game you ever played, or that sort of thing, but as a creator, I guess you're more interested in what I've created. So I made a few games before I became a professional, just random stuff thrown up online on the ancient incarnation of my website, the first edition of the Neverwhere game, a game called Iron Empire, which is steampunk before steampunk really took off, but taking a more kind of difference engine approach. I made a game for a friend based on Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future, and I made little dice games based on the Zenith comics. Things like that. I had fiddled around with game design a fair bit. I made a whole science fiction version of Dragon Warriors, which I keep meaning to write up for Dave Morris because he's expressed an interest. But professionally, independently, as a game producer, I wrote some stuff for other people, but then when it came to creating my own game, I settled on a game called Cloak of Steel. That was my first proper foray into game writing. Now, back then, I had the bright idea of operating Postmortem Studios as a collective, a cooperative. I wanted to make it a kind of open thing that anyone could contribute to and everyone would profit from. That way a lot of people would be invested in its success, a lot of people would have work involved in it, and that seemed to me a good way to launch a project with the best chance of success. However, it became rapidly apparent that the only person really interested in putting the time and the effort in was me. So I learned a harsh lesson when it comes to idealism, and I said fuck it, and I made Postmortem Studios a regular partnership, a regular sole trader, and away I went and completed the game. So my influences at the time were Escaflowne. I was interested in the idea of a flat Earth. I've never believed in it, but what would it be like if you wanted to make a truly fantastical setting? That struck me as being a good way to do it, and the kind of realistic implications of monsters and magic and all the rest of it. So it's a game with a very detailed and cohesive background. It's a kind of mishmash of fantasy Europe and other cultures. One bit I'm particularly proud of is a culture based on some aspects of South Asian culture, Indian culture, Hindu culture, where they're not afraid of the dead, and they regard the body after you die as being an empty shell that's meaningless. So they raise the dead and they use them in place of slave labour, and their fantasy mecca made out of reconstituted bodies and bone and so on. It just struck me as a very pragmatic, realistic thing to do in a world of necromancy and magic and the dead. That why waste that? If you can have the economic benefits of slavery without slaves, with mindless fleshy automatons, without the expense of creating a golem and so on, wouldn't that be interesting? And so they're exiles from their home culture, and they've set up a single city-state on the continent where the game takes place. I did it in D20 at the time. D20 was popular, and at the start of the project, it being a cooperative, we were angling for what would have the most chance of success. I have considered doing another edition at some point, and I wanted to use Silhouette. That's the system that governs Heavy Gear, Jovian Chronicles, all of those, because it scales really well. It's really good at that. And they had agreed at one point that I could use their system, and then I think they were launching the new edition and backed off away from that. So I may have to just retro-clone it or find something that works in a similar way. I did a version of Fate that works with Giant Mecha, so maybe I'll come back around, cycle back around, and do another edition of that game at some point. The trouble with me is I always like to move on, I always like to move forward, I always like to do something else. I don't necessarily like to go back and rehash old games and do new editions. It's just not particularly me. But I might. It's also got the distinction of being the only game that I've licensed out to anyone else to do another version of. And there was a French version with some brilliant illustrations done by John Doe, their version of D20. They sent me some copies, they paid me a rather handsome upfront sum for the rights, but I don't think it did too well for them, and I don't even know whether they're still going, unfortunately. But it was a really nice looking game. So yeah, there's my the first proper game I properly independently published. Cloak of Steel.